Welcome back everyone to Tarantula Exotics, and today we are talking all about feeders. Yes, that's right, you can see them all in front of me. We have a variety of feeders to go over today, so stay tuned. Yes, that is right, today we are talking all about feeders and which are the best for your tarantulas, specifically if you live in Canada. I've seen this question posted in several of the groups and felt like this was a gap that has not yet been covered by many YouTubers. Now, some of you may have watched my previous attempt at understanding a tarantula's dietary needs, and if you did, you know that in the end there just isn't enough research to truly understand exactly what a tarantula's diet should entail. So does that mean that this video is going to be purely speculative? Well, not exactly, because while we may not know what a tarantula's dietary needs are from a scientific standpoint, we do have several keepers with years of experience to lend a hand. For this video, I have contacted the 3 major tarantula retailers in Canada and asked each of them what they feed their tarantulas. I've also used my own 15 plus years of feeding tarantulas as a basis as well. So the first thing we should talk about before simply naming a feeder as the best possible option is which ones are available, followed by their pros and cons. On this list, we will cover crickets, mealworms, superworms, waxworms, butterworms, silkworms, and hornworms. You may have noticed roaches are not on here, and before you comment, that is because they are illegal in Canada. Actually, now that I think about it, ask anyways, as comments are good for the YouTube algorithm. Shout out to my dry bread. Anyways, also mice and rodents are not going to be covered here either, as this is a controversial subject that there just isn't enough evidence to support these as viable feeders either way. My personal opinion though, you should not feed rodents to your teas. Now that that's out of the way, let's begin. Kicking things off, we have crickets. Crickets tend to be widely available across the country, and some retailers will even ship them to your door. One of the biggest benefits of crickets are that they come in a variety of sizes that are suitable for all life stages of your tarantulas. From pinheads to adult crickets, you are sure to find an appropriately sized prey item for your tea. The downsides, which can honestly be solved by one simple solution, which I will get to shortly, are that they have a short lifespan and often can be considered a danger to your tea. Crickets are known to be cannibalistic and can quickly eat each other, and if they can eat each other, then there is not much stopping them from eating your tea as well. While this is a risk, there are 2 simple measures to help reduce these risks and also help the crickets thrive and live longer. Feed them. Yes, I know this seems obvious, but I am always surprised by the number of people who do not feed their feeder. Give them carrots and lettuce and they will live much longer. Have you ever had an escaped cricket? I guarantee it's going to live longer than anything in that container it came in, especially if you're not feeding them properly. But anyways, the carrots act as a nutrient and a food source, and the lettuce acts as hydration. Whatever you do, do not use commercially available cricket food or those stupid gels. They cause nothing but bacterial growth and generally are more harmful than helpful to your crickets. I will say this, however, wash the carrots and lettuce vigorously to ensure you remove any pesticides that could harm your crickets or your tea. A well-fed cricket will be much less of a threat to your tarantula than a desperate starving one. Next up, we have mealworms. Mealworms are typically readily available as well as their larger counterpart, superworms. These worms have a harder shell, and the main benefit is that they will live a very long time in the container they come in, even without being properly fed. Mealworms and superworms are the larval forms of the 2 species of darkling beetle. These beetles should not be offered as a food source to tarantulas, as they lose much of their nutritional value as well as have a much harder exoskeleton once changed. The downsides to the worms, however, are twofold: the hard shell as well as the ability to bite or harm your tea, just like crickets. I don't know how many of you have been bit by a superworm, but it is definitely noticeable. The large downsides also include the lack of size options. While mealworms can typically be fed to juvenile spiders, they're often too big for slings or too small for adults. Superworms, on the other hand, are too big for slings and juveniles and should only be offered to adults. While some people will say you can cut them up for slings, my issue with this is that by cutting them up, it can often quickly lead to mold buildup in an enclosure, which for slings especially can be deadly. Next are waxworms and butterworms. These are not quite as commonly available as crickets or superworms, but can still be found if you know where to look. Waxworms are the larval stage of the wax moth, and butterworms are the larval stage of the Chilean moth. Although I came across a post suggesting that butterworms sold in the pet trade won't turn into anything because they have been irradiated to stop their transformation. I don't know if this is true or not, but on its own, it's disconcerting enough to not offer them as a viable food source for teas. So we will remove these guys from the list just for that. Waxworms, on the other hand, have definite downsides. They do not live long at all, and many people are lucky to get more than a few days out of them once home from the pet store. This is because their dietary needs are incredibly limited. In the wild, they typically live in beehives where they eat honey and the wax within, a diet that can't really be matched in captivity. Generally speaking, they are one of the least harmful options to your tea as far as threats go, However, again, we are limited by their size to mostly young juveniles, as they are once again too large for slings and too small for adults. Also, because of their mortality rate, they are huge contributors to mold if the tea refuses to eat them. They also don't move too much, so this mutes the tea's natural hunting instincts. Lastly, we have hornworms and silkworms. These are not only hard to find, but usually stupidly expensive, retailing for anywhere from $3 to $4 per worm, and that's if you can find them. Silkworms turn into silk moths, and hornworms turn into the sphinx moth. You should seriously look these guys up. They're actually very cool. Also, kind of makes you rethink feeding gummy worms to your tea. But, I mean, to each your own. Anyways, these are a viable food source, so let's just put that aside briefly. These worms are typically quite large. Even the small versions are usually too big for even most juvenile species, which means they are pretty much exclusively for adults. While some will say you can also chop these guys up for slings, I'd like to remind you of mold that will almost definitely follow, even if your sling does finish a small piece that it was given. The lack of a hard shell is a positive, and they are typically not a threat to your tea. However, the biggest downside is the lack of diet for these worms. In fact, when I purchased these worms here, I had to go to PetSmart to get them because my usual store was actually sold out of them. These are actually much smaller than my usual store would have. And when I went to PetSmart, I did ask them if they would throw in a little bit of food for them, just so they would live longer, and PetSmart refused. Anyways, back on topic. Additionally, these worms rarely have the opportunity to transform for this same reason, so again, we are feeding a starving prey item to our tarantulas. Something about that doesn't sit well with me personally, but maybe I'm just too sensitive about it. So in the end, what do I think is the best feeder, and how does it compare with the major retailers here in Canada? My pick are crickets, specifically ones that have been well fed prior to feeding. They are available in many sizes, and despite the recent videos talking about parasites in them, I am very confident this is not an issue, at least here in Canada. If you think differently, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section, of course, or if you've had different experiences, but from my experience of 15 plus years feeding them, I have never had any sort of parasite affect a tarantula when eating crickets. Anyways, most crickets do come from the same few breeders, so maybe that's part of the reason why, and they have been raised in a very clean environment away from parasites, probably another contributing factor to that reason. So it may not be the same across the world, but at least here in Canada, you should be safe with crickets. But the big question is, that's just my 2 cents, what do the retailers think? Well, Tarantula Canada had mentioned that in the 20 plus years they've been in operation, they have exclusively fed crickets, with maybe 2 or 3 exceptions of some superworms during that time frame. Dawn from Tangled Webs had something similar to say, where she said she uses crickets as a primary food source, however has used worms and other larger prey items just to help out females who have just laid an egg sac. And finally, Bruce has mentioned that the same thing, he primarily uses crickets, but he does use superworms and mealworms as a treat as well. So next time you go to the store and are looking for your next feeder for your tarantulas, your best bet is probably going to be crickets. If you want to use worms as an occasional treat, that's personally my recommendation. I wouldn't do any more than that. If you want to vary the diet, that's the way to do it. But you should have crickets as a staple food source. Just my opinion and those of the retailers here in Canada. If you have something different or you have different opinions or thoughts, make sure to leave them down in the comment section down below, because I am curious to hear what you guys think on this and what you guys all feed your tarantulas. With that in mind, the last question we have to answer is, of course, now that we know what to feed our tarantulas, the big question is, how often should we feed them? And unfortunately, you're gonna have to wait for another video for that one, because that's next week's video. If you're not already subscribed and you want to subscribe, hit that subscribe button, ring that bell notification to be notified of future videos. Like I said, next week we'll be talking about the quantity of how much to feed a tarantula, and it's gonna be a pretty short video, but I think I'm gonna have some fun with it, so stay tuned for that. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.